Let's face it, getting epic shots in an epic location is easy. Sadly, not everyone has the same opportunities to travel and visit these places. We've all been there. You see an epic travel clip on YouTube and boom, you feel inspired. You grab your camera and run outside, but there's only one problem. You don't have a crazy location to shoot. As someone who used to make a living from travel and documentary films, the pandemic really shook my foundations when for over a year, I didn't have the opportunity to go to these amazing locations I've become so used to. Instead, I had to learn to use what I have around me and how to get the best out of a boring location. So that's exactly what this video is about. Take a look at these clips. You might imagine it being shot on an exotic island somewhere. The Philippines, Bali perhaps. What if I told you that this was filmed in my neighbor's garden in the heart of a busy city, far from the ocean, nowhere near the mountains, and not a single epic waterfall? Or how about this forest? Well, you probably can't call it a forest because it's really just a tiny park surrounded by houses in a residential area. I've compiled a list of 7 tips that you can use to create more interesting scenes and get more value out of your locations. Tip number 1. Angles are everything. This is exactly the same shot, one aimed at eye level and one low to the ground. Going low to the ground can instantly transform a scene and remove distracting background elements, especially on the wides where it's not as easy to hide stuff, like in this case, the street and houses. Going low and shooting up is also a way to capture wides with more interest. Like in this scenario, we're using the treetops as a background with this big branch as an element enhancing movement. You can always flip it around and shoot from the top down. A simple twist paired with movement adds a dynamic to an otherwise flat image, which brings me to my next point. Tip number 2. Handheld. I prefer shooting handheld over a gimbal in these scenarios because it's much easier and faster to frame a shot to hide distracting elements, and you have more control over the framing while doing the camera movement. Like in this example, pushing the camera forward and slowly tilting up, keeping our subject in frame with more precision than on a gimbal. Shooting handheld also enables you to get shots that are not possible with a gimbal, like tracking movements. Dynamic shots like this adds more interest to a scene, so try to move the camera as much as possible. Tip number 3. Lighting. Now you don't need to invest thousands of dollars in lighting equipment or have a massive crew, but having some control over the light will instantly transform an unflattering image into something special. A simple budget solution is a 5-in-1 reflector to diffuse harsh light or bounce fill light. In the first example, I'm using the diffuser to soften the sun, immediately resulting in a flattering skin tone, which enables me to get a more balanced exposure of the background. Depending on the position of your subject, you can also use the reflector to bounce fill light into the face, but if the sun is not giving enough bounce for a natural looking shot, you can always try artificial light. I love tube lights because they're battery powered and they're easy to set up even without an assistant, but the value it adds is tremendous. The most important part about using fill, whether it's a reflector or a tube light, is the placement of the light in relation to your subject. Our key light, the sun, is coming from behind at a 45-degree angle. You want to position the full light from the same side to motivate the sun, so we're not trying to fill in any shadows, but simply enhance the sunlight as if it's a bit more to the left. The wrong way would be to place the light on the shadow side of the face and fill from the opposite side of the sun, but now it's pretty obvious we're using a light and we're losing depth in the face. If you want to mess around more during the middle of the day, you can take it a step further by using a larger diffuser, like a scrim gym. In this case, we used an 8x8 with a half silk, giving us more freedom to go wider on the movements. Tip number 4. Lens choice. Although depth of field is not the determining factor for something to be cinematic, shooting wide open at f1.4 or f1.8 helps to knock out the background by blurring out distractions. So basically, a prime lens is your best bet. The 35mm is my favorite focal length overall, coming in just wide enough for most wides, but still being able to capture portraits. Going in tighter or putting on a longer lens makes it even easier to avoid unwanted backgrounds, but be careful that you don't end up with too many tight shots because you don't want to box in your viewer. Tip number 5. Depth. A wide open aperture is not the only element that contributes to depth. Your subject in relation to the camera can also give you a different perspective. Like in this example, even at f1.4 the background looks flat, because the wall is too close to our subject. By simply moving the camera to the side, we're not only getting more depth, but we suddenly have this interesting foreground to use for movement. Foregrounds not only enhances movement, but it also adds more depth to a scene. So I'm constantly searching for this in a frame. An out of focus foreground, an in focus subject, and an out of focus background. This shot was taken at the very edge of the park, right next to the fence. But because I'm shooting from a lower angle and a sheer distance to the end of the park, you won't know about all the houses if you didn't see the BTS. Tip number 6. Details. Since you don't have many options for epic wide frames, you should focus on making your close-ups more epic. Going in tight on details are great fillers for B-roll and helps to connect your shots to each other. Tip number 7. Last but not least, grading. This is the original color that came out of the scene in the garden. Using a stylized LUT with desaturated greens and an exposure mask, I was able to instantly transform the image into something more film-like. Don't be scared to mess around with the colors. You don't have to settle for a natural look. This video is proudly brought to you by the Alpha Universe, a free learning platform with educational content from a variety of photographers and filmmakers across all genres. I currently have an exclusive training series on there you can unlock for free by simply registering your Sony gear. Check out the link in the description.